Well, hey, welcome to Treeline. Welcome to our kind of 1 week out Christmas service. Glad you guys are here. Merry Christmas. So, man, I love doing Christmas services, and I love even like getting around like singing these songs because they're kind of nostalgic, right? Like we had a couple people who were like, I didn't sing some of these, but a lot of us grew up singing these. And the reason I love Christmas is because it is this like coming together. There's like this nostalgia play happening like all around us, right? It's like everywhere you go, it's like you're singing these songs. You're like, we've been singing these songs for a really, really long time, and we've been thinking about these things for a really, really long time. There's something about Christmas that feels familiar, but the story of the birth of Jesus is really quite an incredible story. And each of the gospel accounts kind of has a different kind of angle on it. It fills in different details, but we're in Matthew today. So if you got a Bible, you can kind of pull it out. We're going to be kind of jumping around in the first 2 chapters. We kind of said at the beginning of this year, as we kind of jumped into the study of Matthew, we're going to skip the first 2 chapters. We're going to come back to them and come to Christmas. So that's what we're doing today. But the story of Christmas, right, has some familiar things. We know that Jesus would be born in the city of Bethlehem. We know that he'd be laid in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. And by the way, quick side note, I had to go all the way to Palestine to figure this out. But the inn, you guys, that's like no room for them in the inn, right? That's like part of the story. The inn is actually what you call like the main level of like a house, right? And so I didn't know this, but like I actually went to like a first century house, walked around, they were explaining this. So this means like Jesus probably wasn't actually born in a barn because there was no room in the hotel, right? That's not like, that was my whole life growing up. I thought that's what that song was about, and that's what those verses were about. But no, actually, Jesus was born. He was wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger, and likely it was like this area, kind of like underneath the main home where they kept the storage and the animals. It'd be like the small cave carved out of the rock, but it wasn't like there's no room in the hotel, so they're in the barn, right? It's like, no, they're still like in the house, but it's like in the underneath part, and that's where Jesus was born. Now, definitely still not like 4 stars, right? Like definitely not where you want to be, kind of like have your first night's sleep. But Jesus would eventually be visited by shepherds, right? Eventually wise men would bring gifts. And we're told in this section in Matthew that Michael read earlier that Mary and Joseph were to give this child a name, Jesus. And it says the reason he's supposed to be called Jesus is because he will save his people from their sins. And as Matthew starts his story of Jesus, he says that all of these things that happen kind of surrounding his birth, it happens to fulfill prophecy. And it's interesting, most kind of biblical scholars, there's a little bit of disagreement of like how many prophecies exactly in the Old Testament Jesus fulfills, but most people will land on somewhere around 600 or a little bit more. Everything from where he will be born to what his life will look like to how he will teach people, like the methods he will use. But Matthew wants to start the story of Jesus by looking at the prophecy in Isaiah 7. And this is where it is. This is Matthew 1:23. And he's saying all of this happened to fulfill this prophecy. And here's the prophecy. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. And as Matthew begins the story life of Jesus, he zooms in on his birth and he goes, he's going to be called Jesus, but I want you from the very beginning to know that everything that's happening, even his name Jesus, is to fulfill this prophecy about another name he's going to have, which is Emmanuel. And he tells us what it means. It means God with us. And so what he's going to do in the first 2 chapters of Matthew is he's going to tell us the story of Christmas, but he wants to tell it in kind of an interesting way. He's going to start by giving us a lineage, like 2,000-year lineage, and then he's going to go into this birth, this virgin birth, and then he wants to focus on his name, Emmanuel, God with us. Now, raise your hand if you like had a moment in the last couple of months where you're like, hey, Christmas is coming up. I'm going to read one of the Christmas stories in the Bible. Did anyone do that? A little bit, maybe? Some people? No one? Okay, I did. Anyway, I'm supposed to. I'm a pastor. It's fine. It's my job. Anyway, but I was laughing about this because we saved Matthew, the first 2 chapters, for Christmas time. And we were thinking, hey, we'll do that. And I remembered why we did that way back when we were starting this church way back in September. Okay, not that long ago. But I remember why we did that because Matthew starts with 2.5 minutes of genealogy. That's the whole beginning. It's like the lineage of Jesus. It starts, and I was laughing so hard about this because when people are new to Christianity and they're like, hey, I want to read the Bible, almost all of us, what do we say? We say, hey, don't start in page 1. Don't start in Genesis. There's a lot of confusing stuff in there. Just start in the New Testament. And this is what we have people read. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nanshon. That's it. That's how you start. And it goes on for 2 minutes. And then you're, okay, if you're like reading the Bible for the first time, you get there and you're like, okay, I'm supposed to read this. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. And you're like, okay, after the deportation of Babylon, you're like, okay, I'll catch up here. Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel. Like, if you pick up this book and you're like, I want to read the Christmas story, and then all of a sudden, like 2 minutes in, you're like, what in the world? I can't pronounce these names. I'm trying to be a spiritual person, read my Bible. As soon as you get to Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel, you're like, I don't know if I'm going to be a spiritual person. Like, I don't know if it's going to happen. There's got to be a different way. When is the last time you read a lineage? It's been a long time. I was laughing about this because the new Lord of the Rings series on Amazon, The Rings of Power, anyone watch that? It's mixed reviews, fair enough, okay? But the whole end of the show has to do with a lineage, and it's kind of like the climax. Like, there's this lineage that's going to come out that's going to kind of unveil things, and all of it happens off screen. There's like a librarian that they send to go find this thing. We never see him doing that, and eventually there's like a scroll, but it's never read, right? Like, you never read the thing, but the whole New Testament goes, no. We're going to start this whole thing by actually listing out the full 2,000-year history of everyone in Jesus' family that came before him. It's kind of amazing. And the reason I think Matthew starts this way is because Matthew's actually an incredible storyteller. He starts this way because actually the lineage of Jesus is one of the best ways to explain who he is. And he's coming into the story as part of the story of humanity, yet he's coming as someone who's coming from the outside of it. Right? He's like, here's the 2,000-year history, all 42 generations that came before Jesus, and also he was born of Mary, who was a virgin. So it's like, here's his human history, yet he's coming from outside of it. And one of the things that's interesting about a lineage is most of the times you present a lineage. I don't know how many of you, like when you were, like when you present yourself, you're like, well, here's who I am. And you go back, ancestry.com, and you go back. Most of us don't do that because most of us don't have an impressive lineage. But the reason you would present that is to demonstrate like the purity of your bloodline, right? You'd be like, hey, I came from greatness, therefore I will be great. But Jesus' lineage is actually not like that. The way this lineage is written is actually pretty strange, and it's intentionally strange. Because you get these little qualifiers that Matthew gives us to try to explain, hey, what kind of family is Jesus being born into? And here's what you get. All these qualifiers, they add up to basically say this. Jesus is being born into a profoundly broken family with like specific, detailed, really profound brokenness, and yet it's a family that had promises and God's faithfulness stamped all over it. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of this from this lineage. This is verse 3 of Matthew 1. It says, and Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, right? Matthew kind of puts that in. It's not just like, hey, here's like all the lineage. He goes, oh, here's how this happened. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Now, Tamar, if you don't know this is one of the worst stories in the Bible. We don't have time to get into it, but it starts with deception and it ends with incest. And that's how you get Judah. And Jesus, one of his other names is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. In verse 5, it says this, and Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab. First of all, Salmon. Can we just stop for a minute and talk about that name? How many of you are like, Salmon is at the top of your list of boy names, right? You're like, Salmon, he's going to be strong. Swimming. I don't know, it's such a funny name, Salmon. I'm going to trip on this. But this is what it says. Hold on. I'm going to trip on this if I don't move it. It says, this is a cool rug, but I don't want to die up here. Salmon is the father of Boaz by Rahab. And so it gives you that, right? By Rahab. It's like, hey, clue in what's happening in this story. And most of us don't know all these stories, but everyone who was reading this, who was a Jewish person, they immediately clicked and they remembered this story. Oh, Rahab. We know who that is. There's no real easy way to say this. She was a woman of the night, a prostitute. That's Rahab. That's her story. And God looks at her and he goes, no, this person will do nicely. How do you feel about being Jesus' great-great-grandma? And then verse 5, it continues, and Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. Now, Ruth has such a cool story. She's an ethnic and kind of religious outsider. She's not Jewish. She's not part of God's covenant people in that way, but God doesn't care. And he's like, hey, no, come into this story. Come in, become part of my family, become part of the story of redemption. And then in verse 6, it says, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. It's interesting, her name's not even listed. It just says by the wife of Uriah. And that's kind of the point. Because King David saw someone else's wife bathing, wanted to get more information on her, so I had a servant go get her for him, coerced her into sleeping with him. Eventually, she got pregnant, and in trying to cover up all of this, trying to cover up all of it under the rug, eventually King David has Uriah killed. Murdered. I mean, it is a tragic, horrible story. And God's like, this will do nicely. This will be a perfect type of situation for Jesus to be born into this family. And in the end, Jesus is born into a family that's now marked by an unplanned, kind of out of wedlock pregnancy that no doubt in this kind of cultural time was like a big taboo and kind of red flag on their whole family. And I think the reason Matthew gives us like the whole lineage of Jesus, even highlighting some of the darkest parts of it, is because Jesus isn't coming as an observer of the human story. He's actually becoming part of it. Like Jesus isn't coming into our world, but he's actually just going to be intertwined with it. With all of its flaws, with all that's broken and wicked and traumatic about it, God's like, hey, that's going to be my family. And it's not just going to be my family loosely. It's like, no, I'm going to take their name. I'm going to take their history so that at the very beginning of the story of God and the person of Jesus Christ, it just says the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. How is the creator of all going to be introduced to us as the son of part of his creation? It's stunning, but I think one of the things this is supposed to do is just help us with some of the questions we have in our life. Like, do you ever feel far from God? Like, does it ever feel like your story, like the kind of the chapter you're in, or just like the whole of your story, does it ever feel like it takes place like light years away from whatever is going on in heaven and whatever, if there is a creator, whatever he's doing, like my story takes place so far away from that? Well, I think Matthew starts here because he's saying, no, you have to understand, you don't live your story light years away from God. God actually knows your story. He's lived your story. He wants us to understand that Jesus isn't just kind of an observer of our world, but he actually entered into our world. And it's more than that. Because this family is unique. It's not just a uniquely broken family, although I think it kind of is. Like, you go back through the whole story of Israel, it's hard to find a more messed up family than this. Like, it's a messed up family. But it's also a family that has promises written over it. You see, Jesus is coming into a story that's been unfolding. And so the very first verse in Matthew says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Matthew. You see, what Matthew wants to do is he wants to take us back to the very beginning. He's like, if you're going to understand Christmas, there's this baby that's kind of born in a manger. If you're going to understand Jesus' birth, you need to understand where his story starts. And he talks about Abraham. Now, it's really interesting because Abraham is like chapter 1 in God's super specific plan of redemption. And this whole family is basically God's answer to the problem that everyone born into this world faces. Like the whole Bible, right? It's pointing into this family from Abraham onwards and saying somehow this family is going to be the answer to the problem of the world. Well, what is the problem? Well, let's talk about it a little bit. Because if he's going to go all the way back to Abraham, Abraham comes right after Genesis 1 through 12, which gives us the situation we find ourselves in. And the Bible tells us that our story, the story of humanity, the story that kind of Jesus being born into, the story began in a place described as a garden called Eden. And in that garden, the Creator God walked and talked and lived with humans in this really close, tight relationship. And human beings were actually designed in his image, reflecting his glory. And the whole kind of picture, the beginning of the Bible, is this idea that heaven and earth are not two totally distinct places, but actually they're kind of merged together in this place called Eden, where God and humanity are together. And that's the design. And when God looks at it, the world, he looks at kind of heaven and earth joined together in this place with God and humanity kind of existing together side by side. He looks at it and he says, it is very good. But we sinned and we rebelled against God. And in the first chapters of Genesis, the Bible tells us that when we did this, when we kind of stepped out of that close relationship and began to pursue something else, the Bible says that our relationship with God was severed. And because of our sin, because of this choice to kind of pull away from God, we were not only separated from our home, but more than that, we were separated from our Creator. And the Bible says that when this happened, it wasn't just that like we kind of lost this relational tie to God, but actually it's like earth and heaven themselves kind of moved away from each other. Like it isn't just us who experience the consequences of our choices, but the whole world we live in also faces the consequences of this decision. And like orphans let loose in this world, we all still feel the sting of what we've lost. And the Bible would say things like this. It'd be like, no matter how long we call this broken world home, it kind of points at this and says, hey, you know how we call it home, but you never manage to really feel at home in it? You know how it feels like there's always something missing in your life that you can never quite find? And even when you have the thing you wanted, it feels like it's not quite enough. The Bible starts with the story of why that is true, why we feel that way. C.S. Lewis, was a professor at Oxford for many years. This is what he says. He says, our lifelong nostalgia, our longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we now feel cut off, to be on the inside of some door which we've always seen from the outside. That's no mere kind of neurotic fancy. It's not just something that's happening in your brain, he says, but it's actually the truest index of our real situation. You see, there's a lot of different ways that the world has kind of come up to try to solve this thing, this kind of existential crisis that we feel. And it's part of the human condition, right? Is to be like perpetually unsatisfied, right? And there's so many different things in the world that kind of come in and try to address this situation. But what's interesting is the Bible doesn't try to explain away this longing within you as though it were just some kind of after effect of a troubled childhood, right? It's like your parents kind of messed up and that's why you feel this way. It doesn't say that. Or it doesn't say it's some kind of aging psychological remnant of the evolutionary process, that's kind of why these things happen in our minds. The Bible says the reason that we never quite feel whole is because we're not. And the reason that we feel so often, even when our lives are so full of stuff, the reason it feels like there's a piece missing from ourselves and from our lives, the Bible says the reason you feel that way is because there is. The Bible tells a story of humanity, and it starts by telling us a story of what we lost. And it tells us a story of how in that vacuum, how in that void, we began to try to go out into the world and try to find things to satisfy us, find things that would kind of maybe fill this hole we now have in our lives. And so the Bible, the whole story of the Bible, right, it says this. So we created these small statues of men and women and animals, and we kind of bowed down to them as though this hunger, this longing we had inside of us was merely a hunger for worship and a transcendent experience. So we went out into the world and we created religions of all different kinds and shapes to try to figure out some way to maybe kind of fill this void through a transcendent experience. And we read books and studied. We became men and women of knowledge as though the thing we were hungry for was a hunger of the mind. We pursued relationship after relationship, body after body, as though our hunger was only a hunger for a kind of sexual fulfillment or relational affection. And we pursued money, and we bought cars and houses and boats and toys as though our longing was only a longing for the physical and the material. And we pursued the depth of ourselves and our desires, and as though our hunger was only a hunger for true self-expression. And we bought vans and bikes, we bought plane tickets, as though the desire within us was merely a desire for geography or aesthetics. And while all of these things soothe the ache, right? All these things do something for us. They never seem to really give us what we're looking for, do they? I mean, how many of you, after that last vacation you took, you came back and you were like, I am now whole. Like, I am fine now. Everything is okay. No. Because no matter what mountain we are on, or who we fall asleep next to, or what test we aced, or what house we bought, we all fall asleep with a gaping hole in our humanness. Because the one thing we need is the one thing that is out of our reach. The Bible says that the reason you feel this way is because the thing you're looking for is God. There's a lot of people who've tried to define the human condition, but this is how the Bible defines it. It says you're made for God uniquely, and you don't have many more. And it's into this story that God begins to speak. It's so amazing, right? Jesus, he starts with this lineage, and it's going all the way back to the very beginning. And it's looking at the problem. And the problem is actually there was a time where humanity and God lived together. They were close. They were tight. They were united. And then something happened that broke that relationship. And the whole rest of the story of the Bible, God is speaking into the situation with these promises. And one of the very first promises we see is Genesis 3:15. Do you know Genesis 3:15? It's awesome. It's speaking into this as Adam and Eve are being kind of cast out of the garden. God speaks this. He says, one day there's going to be someone born of the seed of woman, meaning a human being is going to be born into this world who will undo all that has been broken. Genesis 12, right? It's the verse talking about Abraham. God picks Abraham out of all the families of earth. He just picks this dude. Dude's got nothing about him noteworthy except his name is Abram, right? Picks him out and he's like, hey, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to choose you. You're going to be my people. I'm going to be your God. And actually, I'm going to bless you so that through you and your offspring, I will end up blessing the whole world. Genesis 49, it keeps going in the story. It eventually gets to Judah, and it just says, the scepter, this kingly rule and authority, it shall not depart from Judah until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nation shall be his. Or you get to 2 Samuel with David, and it says, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And eventually you get to Isaiah 7, right? This thing that Matthew is kind of highlighting for us. It says, therefore the Lord will give you a sign. And here's what will happen. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call his name Emmanuel. You see, Jesus has such a fascinating history because in one sense, he's being born into the story of humanity. He's kind of taking the name of all these people that came before him. He's identifying with them in the most profound way that you could possibly identify someone, to literally become like them. And yet we're told that Jesus would not be born in a normal way. He'd be born of a virgin. And this is so interesting because the Bible and all the history of Christianity insist on this. So, seriously, it's no, Jesus really was born of a virgin. Mary really was a virgin. And it even kind of gives you that whole thing, right? It even says, Joseph, even after they were wedded, they didn't come together until Jesus was born. It's insisting on that. Why? And why is it even in all the songs that we sing on Christmas? Well, the reason is because the thing that God is doing is he's saying, I'm going to save humanity through humanity, but it's not going to be by someone born in a normal way. The reason the virgin birth is so important is because the thing that the Bible claims about Jesus is that he isn't just a normal human being. He's actually God in flesh. This is what John would tell us at the beginning. It says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And this is the whole thing that Matthew's trying to start with. He's saying his name will be Emmanuel, meaning not just God for us, not just God is helping us, but God with us. God with us. And so, on the edge of the town of Bethlehem, a couple thousand years ago, a little human boy would breathe in for the very first time some of the oxygen of this world that was laced with the smell of animals and hay and all kinds of stuff going on under this house. Like the God who spoke everything into existence would pull into his own human lungs air and would breathe for the very first time. Like I was thinking about this, I read a tweet or a post, I don't know if one of my friends back in Madison, he was just like talking about, he's like, man, I've been thinking a lot about Christmas, and the thing I've been fascinated about was the gestation period of Jesus in the womb. He's just like thinking about it. You ever thought about that? Like not just that God had to be like taught how to speak and how to walk, and Mary and Joseph would hold him by the hands, but like there was a time where he was like this big, really tiny. Like there was a time where it was like just like a couple cells were like coming together, like the most kind of basic thing a human being can be. Like this DNA is starting to grow. Like there was a time that the creator God, the God who is above everything, who spoke everything into existence, he so condescends himself to become with us and like us that he becomes that small and fragile and fundamental that his whole life is wrapped up inside the body of this woman named Mary. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. And I think there's so many things we could take from this. There's so many things you could look at and just be stunned at the idea of the incarnation, that God didn't stay distant, but he actually came to be with us. But here's a few things I think we need to notice, and things that I think make this story not just something that kind of helps us feel good this time of year, but actually can change our lives. Here's one of the things we need to know. The story of Christmas means, without a shadow of doubt, that God is not distant, but he is near. God is not distant, but he is near. The story of Christmas tells us God has come near, and not just close to us in space and time, but God has actually come near to us in likeness. He doesn't just understand you as a designer understands his creation, but he understands you because he's chosen to identify with you, to take your form, to take on your frailty, your vulnerability, your experiences. The birth of Jesus means that God is not far away and distant and abstract, but it means that the creator, the one you long for, the one you want to be near, he is not out there, but he is near. He's knowable. And later in Matthew 7, Jesus is going to say, if you seek him, you will find him. Knock and the door will be open to you, because he's not far away, he's near. But this also means that because God is near, and the way God is near, it means he's not unmoved from the pain and tragedy in your life. Like you have to know this. Like when you're coming in, I think all of us come in with these walls and these questions of what is God like if he even exists? And here's what you need to know about God. He knows your story. Not because he knows everything and he's omniscient. He knows your story because he lived it himself. Jesus was born into tragedy. That's his whole history. Like it goes through the whole lineage, and it's marked by so much pain and brokenness and trauma. And his life wasn't any different than that at all. At times in his life, his whole family didn't believe in him. Any of you grow up in a family where at times you look at your parents and you're like, my dreams for me are not the dreams you have for me, right? There's this distance that can sometimes form. Jesus is like, oh, I know exactly what that's like. My whole family thought I was crazy. Jesus had enemies who lied about him, who trashed his reputation. Jesus had friends who betrayed and abandoned him. He experienced loss and tragedy. And actually, a lot of people who look at the story of Jesus, they would say that Jesus' life actually kind of exists in this almost archetypal way. It's like the archetype of tragedy of the human experience. Because in the very end of Jesus' story, right, you know he's born, but he's born, as the song says, to die. Jesus would eventually be killed. But that isn't just the tragedy, but the tragedy goes so much deeper because Jesus isn't just killed and murdered, he's killed unjustly. And not just unjustly, but he's actually punished and killed because of his righteousness. It's because of his goodness that he's punished. And the one in the world, right, the one in the world who's kind of supposed to administer justice, Pontius Pilate, this one who's supposed to kind of have the ability to administer justice and bring things to order, he actually washes his hands of him. He washes his hands of truth and says, you do whatever you want to him. There's a criminal who goes free in place of Jesus. That's pretty hard to take, right? It's like, who do you want to free? I'll free anyone. This criminal or the perfectly righteous Son of God? And everyone's like, the criminal. Crucify Jesus. Jesus is abandoned by his friends. And it's not that they're not there for him in the hour he needs them most, but actually he's sold out by one of his closest friends with a kiss. And it's like the story doesn't get worse than that. Like you can't have a worse story than that. It's like all the broken forces of this world are bent in upon this one person. And it's like in all of this, I think what the story is saying is it's saying, hey, whatever it is that you are going through, whatever it is, God actually understands. He understands at a deeper level than you could possibly know because he's been there and he's probably been through it worse than you have. He's able to sympathize with that because it's also his story. But I think the other thing that this story tells us is that God, his heart, he's not someone who is merely waiting for us to come and find him, but he's come for us. And this is the thing maybe that Christmas says more than anything. It's like this is not good news because there's a path to God, or it's not good news because Jesus is going to show us the way. No, the reason his name is Emmanuel is because God came for us, to be with us. I mean, the story of Christmas is basically answering the question, how far would God go to find things he loves, to go find what was lost? And the answer is the whole story of Jesus' life. It's the whole story of Jesus' life. That is the answer to that question. How far would God go? Well, the answer is he'd go from heaven to earth. He'd go from a throne to a manger. He'd go from the one who is like incomprehensibly vast outside of space and time. Like he holds time in his hand. He doesn't live by it. He made it for us so that we could have an embodied existence and things would make sense to us. He's like, yeah, I made that for you. And he comes into that story, into his material world, not just so that he could be part of it, not just that he could experience it, but actually so that all of the forces of evil and trauma and wickedness and oppression that we have brought into his world, all of those would be bent towards him in the end. The undying, unborn, uncreated God was born into the world so that he could have a physical body, so that we could grab it, take hold of it, and he could be killed. And he did all of that so that at the end of the story, this man, Jesus Christ, who was buried in the grave, would one day rise again, and he could actually give to humanity the thing that we lost in the first place. After Genesis, in the very beginning, when heaven and earth were ripped apart, you know the very first time you see heaven and earth truly coming together in the same way again is? It's in the person of Jesus Christ. Because Jesus Christ is heaven and earth combined into one. He is God, he is man. And what Jesus is doing is he's coming back into our story and he's saying, I've actually come to remake everything. Right? The story of Christmas, the reason it's so good is not just like a nostalgia play. It's not just kind of playing on our feel-good senses of saying, hey, isn't this awesome what happened a long time ago? He's saying, no, isn't it amazing that because Jesus was born, because God took on flesh, isn't it amazing that because that's true, we know that everything bad will one day be made good. We know that everything broken will one day be healed because we know that the one who came from heaven to earth is actually coming back one day and he's going to bring heaven and earth back together again. And so I don't know where you are in your story. I don't know when you come in here how much of like this world feels dark and difficult. I don't know how many of you learned to drive in the snow for the very first time today. But listen, Jesus came for us. And God is not distant to you. He is near. And he's not unmoved by the difficult things in your life. But he was so moved by them that he came to be with you, to be near you. And not just to be next to you, but actually to provide a way to change your story forever. I'm going to pray in a minute. And we'll keep singing some songs. Let's pray.